Look at this. Hey, back off. Okay, let's go.
The steel bottle came down on the dog's skull with a sound nobody in that park would ever forget. 88 pounds of decorated military working dog folded into the grass, blood spreading behind his left ear, while three rich boys laughed into a live stream. They thought the quiet man on the bench was nobody, a drifter, a joke worth a few thousand views. They had about 90 seconds left to believe that. Before we go on, subscribe and stay with this story all the way to the end, and drop the name of the city you are watching from in the comments so I can see how far this story travels tonight. 36 hours before the bottle, Elias Vance woke at 4:50 in the morning, the way he had woken for 26 years, without an alarm, without a groan, without a single wasted movement. His eyes opened and he was already awake. There was no drifting up out of sleep, no slow return. 1 second he was under, the next he was counting the sounds in the room, and by the time his feet found the floorboards, he had already accounted for every one of them. The pipes ticking, the wind pushing the north side of the cabin, the lake moving against the rocks below, and the low, even breathing of the boy lying across the doorway of his bedroom. Odin never slept beside the bed, he slept across the door. 11 years of that, and Elias had stopped correcting him a long time ago, because it was not a habit and it was not affection. It was a posting. The dog had decided sometime in a country neither of them was allowed to name that no one would ever reach Elias without going through him first, and no amount of soft beds and quiet mornings in Idaho had ever talked him out of it. Elias came down the stairs favoring his right hip the way he always did in the first hour before the joint warmed and the limp shrank into something a stranger could miss. He put water on. He did not turn on a light. He knew where everything in that kitchen was, and he liked the dark, and the dog liked the dark, and neither of them had ever needed to discuss it. By 5:30, they were on the shore road. Redstone Bay was one of those towns in the mountains of northern Idaho where the money had arrived quietly and then never left. 20 years earlier, it had been lumber trucks and fishing licenses in a hardware store that sold bait and paint out of the same building. Now the shoreline was a wall of glass houses that faced the water like they were daring it to rise. Private planes came into the little airstrip on Friday afternoons. There were boats tied up at the marina worth more than every home in the old part of town combined, and most of them never left the dock all summer. They just sat there gleaming, being owned. Elias walked past all of it every morning, and every morning the town looked straight through him. He wore a canvas jacket that had gone the color of wet sand years ago, boots that had been resoled twice, a gray beard trimmed close because he could not stand it any other way. He was 51, and he was built like a man who had been made of rope and then dried in the sun, and he moved with a slight hitch in his stride that people noticed for about half a second before they decided what he was. They decided he was a boat mechanic or a caretaker for one of the summer houses. Or more often, they decided nothing at all, which is a specific kind of decision people make about a man in worn clothes. The woman who ran the coffee stand by the marina had served him a black coffee every morning for 2 years and had never once asked his name. The dock hands nodded at him the way you nod at a mailbox. A realtor had handed him a flyer for a landscaping job once, and he had thanked her politely and thrown it away without being offended because he had learned in his old life that being underestimated was not an insult. It was cover. There was exactly one person in Redstone Bay who called him Elias. Nora Bright ran the veterinary clinic out of a converted feed store on the inland side of the highway, and she had met Odin before she had met his owner. She had been the one to look at the long, hairless scar running across the dog's left shoulder, the one that pulled the fur into a seam like a badly closed zipper, and she had asked what happened. Elias had told her it was an old injury from work. She had looked at him for a long moment, taken in the way the scar radiated outward instead of cutting clean, the way only shrapnel does, and she had not asked again. That was why he trusted her. Not because she was kind, because she knew when to stop. She had told him once that the dog was the most polite animal she had ever handled, and also the most frightening, and that she could not fully explain the difference. Elias had understood exactly what she meant. Odin had never barked at a stranger, never lunged, never pulled at a leash he did not wear. He walked at Elias's left knee off lead through crowds and traffic and past other people's dogs screaming at the ends of their retractable cords, and he did not so much as turn his head. but everything about him was loaded. There was a stillness in him that made grown men take a step sideways without knowing why they had done it. That morning on the shore road, a jogger with headphones came up behind them, fast and blind, and Odin's ears rotated backward a full 2 seconds before Elias heard a thing. The dog shifted a half step to put himself between the sound and the man. Then when the jogger passed and was nothing, he shifted back. It took less than a second. Nobody watching would have seen it happen. Elias reached down without breaking stride and let his fingers touch the top of the dog's head. That was the whole conversation. That was all it had ever needed to be. The trouble found him at 8:40 that same morning, and it came wearing a very good suit. The lawyer's name was Preston Ash, and he worked for a firm in Coeur d'Alene that worked in every way that mattered for one client. It was his third visit to the North Shore in 5 months. He came up the gravel with his shoes already ruined and his smile already fixed, and he did not get out of the car until he had checked that the dog was not loose in the yard. Elias came out onto the porch and stood there with a coffee cup in his hand and waited because he had learned that if you say nothing at all, people will empty themselves out in front of you. Ash emptied himself out. He talked about the North Shore Marina Development Project. He talked about 90 slips in a clubhouse and seasonal employment for the community, and about how the plan had been approved in principle by every board that mattered, and about how it was frankly a formality at this point. Then he got to the part he had actually driven up there to say. He said that Elias's parcel, 6.5 acres with 200 feet of shoreline, was the last piece and that Mr. Ballantine had authorized him to be extremely flexible. He held out a folded envelope. He said the number inside was not a first offer. Elias looked at the envelope for a moment. He did not open it. He took it, turned it over once in his hand and gave it back. And he told Ash the same thing he had told him in March and again in May, that the land was not for sale, that it had never been for sale, and that the answer would not change no matter how many zeros were added to the paper. Ash stopped smiling. He said carefully that Mr. Ballantine was not a man who was used to hearing no, and that these things had a way of becoming complicated, and that permits and easements and access roads and property assessments could all become extremely complicated for a man living alone at the end of a gravel road. Elias set his coffee down on the porch rail. He did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He simply said that he had heard that kind of sentence before in other countries from people who meant it a great deal more than Preston Ash did, and that Mr. Ash should drive carefully because the frost had chewed up the second switchback. Ash was back in his car in under 20 seconds. He did not know that his hands were shaking until he was halfway down the hill. What Preston Ash could not have understood, and what Wallace Ballantine would not have believed, was that Elias Vance would have burned the deed before he sold that land, and it had nothing at all to do with money. The cabin had belonged to Sarah's grandfather. Sarah had spent every summer of her childhood on that shoreline, and she had walked Elias down to the water on the second day he ever met her family, and told him in the flat, certain ways she said everything, that this was where she was going to end up. Not a house on the lake, this house, this water, this exact bend of the shore where the pines came down to the rocks. They had been married 19 years. For 11 of those years, he had been gone more than he had been home. She had never once made him apologize for it, and he had spent a long time believing that was mercy, and had only understood much later that it was something harder and better than mercy. The cancer had come during his last deployment. She had known for 6 weeks before she told him, and when she finally did, she framed it in the smallest possible language, because she knew that a man in the middle of an operation with other people's lives strapped to his back could not afford to be a husband that week. He had gotten home with 11 days left. He had made her one promise in that room, and it was not a promise about grief or about moving on or about being all right. She had asked him to keep the house, to not sell it, not rent it, not let it fall down, to be there in the mornings when the light came up off the water because somebody in the family ought to be. Her gray wool sweater was still hanging on the hook behind the door. He did not look at it every day, but he knew the exact number of days it had hung there, and that was its own kind of looking. So when a billionaire's lawyer stood on his porch and offered him an open number for the ground his wife was buried under, the sightline of Elias Vance did not feel tempted, and he did not feel insulted. He felt tired. And underneath the tired, in a place he kept locked and inspected regularly, the way you inspect a weapon, you hope never to fire again. He felt something cold begin to pay attention. Wallace Ballantyne had not built his fortune. He had inherited a hedge fund and then made it 4 times larger, which in his own mind amounted to the same thing, and he had spent 30 years surrounded by people paid to agree with him. The Marina project was not about the marina. It was about the fact that he had already told 3 separate boards it was happening and had already put his name on a rendering with his own family's crest, worked into the clubhouse stonework, and had already promised the governor's people a ribbon cutting in the spring. The North Shore parcel was 6.5 acres of nothing. It was also at this point a public humiliation with a mailbox on it. He had a chief of police named Roy Kessler who had been receiving what was carefully described as a consulting stipend from Ballantyne Group for 4 years and who had never once consulted on anything. He had a zoning attorney on retainer and a state senator's chief of staff who took his calls on weekends. He had in short every instrument he had ever needed, and he had a son, Gio. Chase Ballantyne was 20 years old, and the single most consistent fact of his life was that nothing he did had ever cost him anything. He had wrecked 2 cars before he was 19 and been handed a third. He had been asked to leave one boarding school and quietly transferred to another. And the incident that caused it had been settled with a family in a lawyer's office in a single afternoon. He understood the world as a place where consequences were a service you subscribed to, and his father had paid for the premium tier before he was born. That summer, he had discovered content. It had started as a joke and turned into the only thing he thought about. He and Dax Whitlow had built an account around the two of them behaving badly in a rich town, and for a while the numbers had climbed, and Chase had felt something he had never felt from money, which was the sensation of being watched by strangers who did not have to watch him. Then the numbers had stalled, then they had started sliding, and Chase had begun to feel for the first time in his life that there was something he wanted that could not simply be purchased and delivered. Dax filmed everything. That was the thing about Dax that Chase found useful and never once thought about carefully. Dax recorded constantly, uploaded selectively, and archived compulsively because Dax had figured out at 16 that footage was leverage and had never gotten around to unlearning it. Ollie Pratt was the third one, and Ollie should never have been there. I was 18, the son of a woman who managed the front desk at the golf club, and he had been absorbed into the group the previous summer the way a small boat gets absorbed by a wake. He laughed at things that were not funny. He said maybe we should go a lot in a voice too quiet to be heard over the others. He had watched Chase pour a drink over a waitress's shoes in June and had gone home and been sick in his own bathroom and had said nothing about it to anybody and had hated himself so specifically and so thoroughly for that silence that he had started sleeping badly. Ollie was the one to remember everything that eventually happened to the Ballantyne family happened because of a boy who could not sleep. The last thing that pushed the day over the edge happened at the marina at 4 in the afternoon, and it was not a crime, and there were no dogs involved at all. Chase found his father on the dock and asked him for money for a project he had described 3 times already, and Wallace Ballantyne did what he had done for 20 years, which was reach for his wallet while looking at his phone. Then he asked without much interest how the internet thing was performing. Chase told him the number. His father made a small sound in his throat, the exact sound a man makes when a stock does something mildly disappointing, and said that it might be time to let that go, and that at some point Chase would need to develop an actual asset. Then he walked away, up the dock, still on the phone, already talking to someone else. Chase stood there in the sun for a while with his father's cash in his hand and his own face burning. It was not the words. It was the tone. It was the specific pitch of a man deciding that his son was a rounding error. He drove to the lookout above the bay and sat in the SUV with the engine off and scrolled his own account for 20 minutes, watching his numbers rot in real time, and something in him that had never been asked to hold weight simply gave out. Dax showed up. Ollie showed up because Ollie always showed up. Chase told them the account was dying and that the problem was that everything they had posted was fake, that everybody could smell that it was staged, that people did not want jokes anymore. He said they needed something real. He said it 3 times, and the third time he was not talking to them. He threw his phone into the passenger footwell, hard enough to crack the case, and then he looked down the hill at the lakeside park where the big oak stood at the edge of the grass near the water. There was a man sitting alone on the bench beneath it with a paperback in his hands. There was a large German shepherd lying in the grass at his feet, chin on his paws, eyes half closed in the heat. Chase Ballantyne reached down and picked his phone back up. The drive down from the lookout took 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes, Ollie Pratt tried 3 separate times to say something and did not manage any of them. I knew what was going to happen, not the details, not the bottle, nothing like that. But he had been riding in the back seat of that vehicle for 14 months, and he had learned to read the specific quality of Chase's silence. And this was the bad one. The one where Chase had been hurt by his father and was now shopping for somewhere to put it down. Ollie had watched him put it down on a valet in April and a waitress in June. And both times, Ollie had sat there with his mouth shut and his heart going like a bird in a box. And both times he had told himself afterward that he would say something next time. He said nothing this time either. He looked at the back of Chase's head and felt the words stack up behind his teeth and stay there. Dax already had the phone out before they parked. He had a rule about that one he had never explained to anybody, because he had never had to. He started recording before he knew what he was recording, because the good stuff never announced itself, and by the time you knew you wanted it, it was gone. He was already live when the tires came up over the curb and onto the grass at the edge of the lakeside park. Chase got out with the water bottle in his hand. It was a heavy stainless steel thing, full close to 3 pounds, and it had been sitting in the cup holder since the marina. He had not picked it up for any reason. He had picked it up because his hands were empty, and he did not like his hands being empty. Across 40 yards of grass, the man on the bench turned a page. Elias had heard the car doors from the moment they opened. He had heard the engine come up the hill before that. He had cataloged 3 voices, 1 loud and 2 following, and he had placed their approach on the grass without lifting his eyes from the book. Because a lifetime ago, he had learned to build a map of the world out of sound alone, and the skill had never left him, not once, not even in the years when he wished it would. Odin lifted his head off his paws. The dog did not growl. He did not stand. He simply came awake in that total way he had every muscle informed at the same instant, and he turned his head up toward Elias and waited for instruction, the way he had waited in Djibouti and Bahrain and in the belly of aircraft over water at 3 in the morning. Elias moved 1 finger against the spine of the book. Down. Odin put his chin back on his paws. His eyes stayed open. The first thing that Chase said from about 15 feet out was that the park was for residents. He said it loudly in a voice pitched for the camera and not for the man, and he waited for the reaction that always came, the flinch or the apology or the defensive little laugh that people gave him when they were deciding how much of themselves they were willing to lose that afternoon. Elias turned another page. That was the first crack in Chase Ballantyne's afternoon, and it was a small one, and it went all the way down. He came closer and said it again with an insult attached. He said something about the jacket. He said something about the smell of the bench. Dax laughed too hard behind the phone the way he did when he was worried the moment was not landing and wanted to convince the audience it had. Elias marked his page with his thumb. What was happening inside him at that moment would have surprised every person standing on that grass. He was not angry. He was working. He had already put the 3 of them in order without thinking about it, the way another man might count change. Loud one in front, closest unbalanced drinking earlier in the day, judging by the flush at his neck and the way he planted his feet. Second one at the flank phone up, both hands committed, therefore not a threat, therefore not a priority. Third one behind and to the left, weight already shifted backward, chin down, a boy who wanted to be somewhere else and did not know how to leave. Distance to contact 4 steps. Time to end all of it under 2 seconds. Elias had spent 26 years learning to hold that arithmetic in one hand and do absolutely nothing with it. That was the part nobody understood. People thought the training was about violence. The training was about the leash. He closed the book and set it on his knee and looked up, and he told them without heat that the dog was under control and that they should take their afternoons somewhere else. His voice did something to the air. Ollie felt it before either of the others did. It was not loud and it was not threatening, and that was exactly the problem with it. Every adult Ollie had ever seen get confronted by Chase had raised their pitch, even the ones who fought back. Their voices had gone up and thin. This man's voice had gone down, and it was level, and it had the flatness of somebody reading a weather report, and Ollie's stomach turned over cold, and he heard himself say quietly that maybe they should go. Chase did not even look at him. He asked the man if he knew who his father was. Elias said he did not care. That was the second crack, and it was much wider than the first because it was said in front of a camera that was live and because it was true. Chase had used that sentence perhaps 200 times in his life, and it had worked 200 times. It worked on club managers and coaches and sheriffs and other people's parents. It was not a question. It was a key, and it opened every door in that county. The man on the bench had listened to it and had not moved a single muscle in his face. Something in Chase came unhooked. He took a step in and swept his foot through the dirt at the edge of the grass so the grit went up into the dog's face. Odin blinked and did not move, and the not moving was somehow worse, and Chase felt it. He put his shoe forward until it was 6 inches from the dog's muzzle, and he asked what the mutt was going to do about it. Elias stood up. He did it without hurry, without a sound, and the difference in the park after he was standing was so immediate that a woman 50 yards away pushing a stroller changed direction without ever consciously deciding. Dax's arm dipped an inch. Even Chase took half a step back before he caught himself, and the fact that he had taken it on camera in front of thousands of people watching a live feed on their phones lit something in him that had nowhere to go. Elias told him to step away from the dog. He did not say it twice. Chase looked at the phone, then he looked at his own foot. Then he kicked. He kicked the way a boy kicks who has never once had to worry about being hit back, all commitment and no defense. And he never came close. Odin rolled off his hip and out from under it in one motion faster than anything that size should have been able to move, and he came up onto his feet already facing the threat, and he barked. It was not a dog bark. It was a wall coming down. It hit Chase in the chest like a physical thing, and he stumbled backward and went down onto one knee in the grass, and his sunglasses came off his head. And for one full second, he was a 20-year-old boy kneeling in the dirt in front of an animal that had decided not to hurt him yet. Dax laughed. That was the part that mattered. Dax laughed out loud, live in front of the entire audience, and said that the dog had almost gotten him. And Ollie, God help him, laughed too. It came out of him before he could stop it, a nervous, strangled sound, and he clapped his hand over his mouth, and Chase heard it. Chase heard him laugh. He got up off his knee with his face the color of a burn, and he did not look at the man on the bench, and he did not look at the dog. He looked at Ollie. And Ollie, who would remember that look for the rest of his life, understood that whatever happened in the next 4 seconds was partly his. Elias saw the grip change on the bottle. He saw the fingers rotate the wrist load, the shoulder drop, and he was already moving when the arm came back. And here is the thing that would be argued in a federal courtroom 8 months later, and that a jury would take 11 minutes to agree on. Elias Vance was 51 years old with a hip full of scar tissue, and he was 10 feet away, and he was fast, and he was not fast enough because Chase Ballantine did not wind up like a man throwing a punch. He swung like a boy hitting a piñata with no thought in it at all, and it was over before it was a decision. The steel caught Odin above and behind the left ear. The sound went out flat across the grass. It was not a crack the way people describe cracks. It was duller and heavier and much more final, and everybody in that park heard it, and the woman with the stroller broke into a run. Odin dropped. I went down sideways with his legs still trying to work and his back feet scrabbled once in the grass, and he tried to get up and got halfway, and then his front end folded and he made a sound that no one who heard it ever fully got out of their head. Blood came down out of the ear faster than any of them expected and matted the tan fur along his jaw, and the dog turned his head and looked for Elias. That was it. That was the thing that broke the world open. The animal was concussed and bleeding on the ground, and his first act was to find his handler with his eyes. Elias reached Chase before Chase had finished shouting. What happened next took 3 seconds, and every one of those 3 seconds had been paid for in blood on 4 continents. Elias took the wrist that held the bottle and turned it in a direction. Wrists do not go, and the bottle was on the ground, and the boy came with the wrist because there is no other option when a joint is loaded correctly. And then Chase Ballantine was against the trunk of the oak with a forearm across his collarbone and a hand still locked on his arm, and he could not breathe and he could not move. And the most terrifying part of it was that nothing about it was rough. There was no choking. There was no strike. There was no shaking, no shouting, no spit. There was a 51-year-old man in a canvas jacket holding him in place with about the same visible effort a person uses to hold a door open, And Chase understood in a total animal wordless way that the amount of force being applied to him was a fraction of 1% of what was available, and that the man had chosen the number and could change it. Elias put his face close and said 8 words. He said that the dog had more honor in one paw than Chase's entire bloodline, and that he would not touch him again. Chase's eyes were running. He had not decided to cry, and he was not aware that he was. Somewhere very far away, he could hear Dax saying his name, and then Elias let go. He let go at 3 seconds, not 4, not 5. He stepped back and put his hands down and turned his back on all 3 of them and walked to his dog, and Chase slid down the trunk of the tree into the grass and sat there gasping with both hands on his own chest. Dax got none of it. That was the part he would try to explain to a federal prosecutor later and failed to explain because there was no explanation that made him look like anything other than what he was. He had dropped the angle when the bottle came down. The phone had swung. By the time he had it back up and pointed, Elias was already walking away, and all Dax had in frame was Chase Ballantyne sitting in the dirt crying with his hands at his throat. Which was, Dax realized about 11 seconds later, the single most valuable piece of footage he had ever captured in his life. They got Chase into the SUV. He was making sounds that were mostly rage now and partly something else. And he was saying that the old man was dead, that his father was going to erase him, that the dog was going to be put down by Friday, and he said all of it at the back of a man who never once turned around. Ollie got in last. He stood at the open door for a second and a half with his hand on the frame, and he looked back across the grass at the man kneeling over the animal. And what he saw was not a Navy SEAL and not a killer, and not anything he had a word for. He saw a man with his palm pressed flat against a dog's skull, holding a folded handkerchief, there leaning down close, and talking to him steadily in a low voice, and the dog was licking his wrist. Ollie got into the car and closed the door and put his head against the window, and did not say one word for the entire drive. Elias did not watch them leave. He had his fingers on the orbital rim, then the zygomatic arch, then the ridge behind the ear, working carefully through the blood for a depression that would have changed everything about the next hour. He did not find one. He found swelling and a laceration and an ear canal filling faster than he liked. He checked the gums and did not like the color. He put his thumb over the eye and lifted the lid, and the left pupil came down, and the right pupil came down slower, and Elias felt something in his chest go very quiet and very cold. He got his arms under the dog and stood. 88 pounds is not much to a man who has carried more, but the hip did not care about that, and it screamed at him all 40 yards to the truck, and he did not slow down. He laid the dog across the passenger seat and got in and drove. Nora Bright had the door open before he was out of the cab because she had heard the way the truck came into the lot. She got one look at the ear and stopped asking questions. It went fast after that. Clippers pressure a line in the front leg, oxygen, the small hard vocabulary of a woman doing something she had done 100 times and had never once done for an animal she personally loved. She asked what hit him. Elias told her the weight in the material and the approximate velocity, and she looked up at him for half a second because nobody in the history of that clinic had ever answered that question that way, and then she went back to work. Odin seized at 11 minutes. It was brief and it was not violent, and it terrified Nora more than anything else that afternoon. And afterward, the dog lay flat with his sides going and his eyes open and not tracking, and Elias stood at the head of the table with both hands on the steel and did not move. The imaging took 25 minutes. Nora came back with it and did not make him ask. She told him there was bleeding under the dura on the left side, that it was not massive, that it was also not stopping on its own, and that pressure inside a skull does not negotiate. She told him the dog needed a neurosurgical decompression, that she could not do it in that building, that the veterinary hospital in Spokane could, and that the window was not academic. 72 hours, and that was generous. She told him it would be around $9,000 and that she would call ahead herself. Elias took out his wallet. He had an ATM card and $240 and a photograph of a woman in a gray sweater standing on a dock. And 11 hours earlier, he had handed a lawyer back an envelope with a blank number in it and told him the answer would never change. He said he would have it by morning. I was still standing there with the wallet open in his hand when the red and blue came up off the wet asphalt outside and swept across the front windows of the clinic. Once and then again, and Nora Bright turned toward the glass and said very softly that there were 3 cars. Orchestrated narrative structure voor mini-climax twist by emotional closure chofankoi. Orchestrated narrative structure voor mini-climax twist by emotional closure chofankoi. The van made it 4.5 miles. The technician driving it was a 26-year-old named Kyle Brennan, who had been at the county job for 7 months and who had read the log entry from Thursday evening before he loaded the crate. He had read the line about the left eye tracking slower than the right, and he had read the line about the animal refusing food, and he had stood there in the county lot at 6:20 in the morning with a clipboard in his hand and a signed order that told him to transport the animal to the county veterinary contractor for humane disposition ahead of a hearing that had not yet happened. He had asked his supervisor about that, about the sequence of it, about why the order was signed before the hearing. His supervisor had told him to drive. So Kyle drove, and at 4.5 miles, he came around the bend on County Road 9 and found the road closed by two vehicles he did not recognize, and a woman in a white Navy service uniform standing in the middle of the asphalt with a federal marshal on either side of her. He stopped the van. He put it in park. He put both hands on the wheel where they could be seen because he was 26 and had never been pulled over by anything more serious than a state trooper. And then he rolled the window down, and the woman handed him a document and told him in a voice with absolutely nothing decorative in it that the animal in the back of his vehicle was federal property and that any further movement of that crate would be a felony committed by him personally. Kyle Brennan read the first 3 lines of the emergency stay order and started to cry. Not from fear, from relief. He would tell his mother about it that night, and he would not be able to explain it any better than that. He had spent 40 minutes driving a dying dog toward a needle because a piece of paper told him to, and a stranger had just walked out of the fog on County Road 9 and taken the decision away from him, and the sound that came out of him was the sound a person makes when somebody else finally picks up a weight they should never have been handed. Rear Admiral Elena Salazar had been on a plane at 4 in the morning. The call had reached her Wednesday, forwarded through 2 offices and a duty officer who had done exactly what he was supposed to do with a message that made no sense, which was to pass it up. A civilian woman in Idaho had called a number and said 6 words and then stopped talking the way she had been told to. Salazar had been in her kitchen. She had listened to the message twice and put the phone down on the counter and stood there with both hands flat on the granite for a long moment while 30 years came up through the floor. Aiden was not a place to her. Aiden was a night. Aiden was 4 aid workers in a compound, and a route in and no route out, and it was a dog that had refused to move at a gate and had refused and refused while 11 men shouted at him because 11 men could not smell what he could smell, and it was a vehicle packed with enough explosive to have taken the whole element off the map. Salazar had been a commander then. She had signed the movement order. She had put those men through that gate herself on paper from a chair. And the reason she had not spent the last 11 years living with 11 names was a shepherd who would not walk forward, and a captain who trusted the dog over the timeline and called a full halt with 30 seconds left on the clock, and who took the reprimand for it afterward and never once said a word in his own defense. She had promised Elias Vance in a hallway in Bahrain that if he ever needed anything at any hour for any reason, he was to call and not to ask. 11 years, one call. She had made the first phone call at 4:40 in the morning, and by 9 at night on Wednesday, the Department of Defense had opened a file, and by Thursday afternoon, a staff judge advocate had an emergency motion in front of a federal judge in Boise, and the judge had asked exactly one question, which was whether the animal was in fact a retired military working dog subject to federal transfer and status provisions. And the answer had come back with a service record attached that ran to 61 pages. The stay was signed at 5:50 on Friday morning. They had made it onto County Road 9 with 11 minutes to spare, and Salazar had spent every one of those 11 minutes standing on the asphalt doing arithmetic she had not done since she was a young officer, which was the arithmetic of how many minutes a decision costs a life. The helicopter took Odin off the road at 7:04. A veterinary trauma team out of Spokane had been standing by since 3 that morning because a Navy admiral had called a hospital administrator personally and had not asked. They took the dog out of the crate on a board with his head immobilized, and one of the techs said out loud before he could stop himself that this animal had been in that box for how long, and nobody answered him because there was no answer that anybody in that road wanted to say in front of a federal marshal. At 7:15, Elena Salazar walked into the Redstone Bay Municipal Police Station in a white uniform with 2 stars on her shoulder boards, and the front desk officer stood up so fast he knocked his coffee over. She did not raise her voice one time in that building. That was the thing everybody there would remember. She had a lawyer from the Judge Advocate General's Corps on her left and 2 federal agents behind her. And she walked past 3 people who tried to speak to her and went directly to the chief's office, and she put the stay order on Roy Kessler's desk and stood there while he read it. Then she told him what he was holding. She told him the animal his department had ordered destroyed had 2 combat deployments and a Department of Defense identification number and a documented record of preventing a mass casualty event, and that the man in his holding cell was Captain Elias Vance, United States Navy, retired recipient of the Navy Cross, 2 silver stars and the Purple Heart, and that his file contained operations that Roy Kessler was not cleared to know the names of. Then she said the only hard thing she said all morning. She told him that she had read his intake paperwork on the drive from the airfield and that there were 4 separate procedural violations in it that a first-year law student would find in 20 minutes, and that he had approximately 90 seconds to decide which side of the file he wanted his name written on, because after 90 seconds it would not be his decision anymore. Roy Kessler asked for a lawyer. He asked for it in a voice that had gone up about half an octave, and Salazar told him that was probably the first sound decision he had made all week. But the collapse of the Ballantyne family did not actually happen in that office, and it did not happen because of a Navy admiral. And that was the part that mattered. It had started at 3 in the morning on Thursday with a boy on a bicycle. Ollie Pratt had gotten into the boathouse. He had known the code because Dax used the same 4 digits for everything, and he had found the canvas bag, and he had sat on the floor in the dark with a laptop on his knees and the external drive plugged in, going through folders, with his hands shaking so badly he kept missing the trackpad. The raw file was 41 minutes long. The clip Dax had cut and sent to the group was 11 seconds of it. Ollie watched the whole thing. He watched the vehicle come up over the curb. He watched Chase cross the grass. He heard an audio so clear it was obscene, his friends say, that they needed something real, and then heard him say the thing about seeing whether the mutt had any fight in him, said out loud on a live feed 40 seconds before the bottle came down. He watched the man on the bench close his book and ask them calmly twice to leave. He watched the kick. He watched the bottle, and he heard himself laugh. He sat on the floor of that boathouse at 3:40 in the morning and listened to his own laugh come out of a laptop speaker, and then he ran outside and was sick in the weeds, and then he came back in and copied the entire file onto a spare drive and a memory card, because some instinct in him that he did not know he had told him that 1 copy was not enough. He had not gone to the police. He had thought about it, and he had understood at 18 years old with total clarity that the police in that town belonged to Chase's father. So he had gone to the only adult he could think of who had touched the dog. Nora Bright had opened her door at 4:15 in the morning to a boy she had never seen before, who was crying so hard he could not say his own name, holding out a memory card in his fist like it was on fire. She had taken it and put it in her computer and watched about 90 seconds of it, and then she had turned around and put both arms around a stranger's kid in her own doorway while he came apart. Then she had done what Elias told her to do the first night. She had made copies, 2 of them. She had time-stamped everything, written a statement of custody in her own hand describing exactly how the file came into her possession and from whom and at what hour. And she had driven 1 copy 40 minutes to a lawyer in Coeur d'Alene who did not work for Wallace Ballantine, and she had kept the original sealed and untouched, which meant that when the federal agents arrived on Friday morning, they were not opening an investigation. They were closing one, because the second thing had happened Thursday afternoon, and Nora had done that too. She had walked down to the marina exactly the way he told her to, and she had stood on the dock and looked up at the northeast corner of the harbor master's building 14 feet up, and there it was. A camera pointing across the park at an angle no one had corrected in 2 winters. The harbor master was a man in his 60s named Del Ruiz, who had been running that harbor for 19 years and who had never particularly enjoyed working for people who owned boats. They did not sail. Nora asked him whether the camera recorded. Del said it did 7 days on a local drive, and that law enforcement had not requested anything. Nora asked him whether anyone had requested he delete anything. Del Ruiz looked at her for a long moment and said that a man from Ballantine Group had come by Wednesday afternoon and asked about the system, and that he had told the man the camera was decorative and had not worked since the storm. Then he said that he had lied. He pulled the file himself in front of her, and he wrote his own name and the date and time on the copy, and he told her that his brother had come home from Iraq in 2007 and had not been the same afterward, and that he had watched that man in the flannel jacket walk his dog past that dock 400 mornings and had never once said good morning to him, and that he intended to fix that. So by the time Elena Salazar walked into the Redstone Bay police station, there were two independent camera angles of the same 40 seconds from two directions with two separate chains of custody held by two people with no connection to each other and nothing to gain. And there was a third thing, and the third thing was the one that ended Wallace Ballantyne. Deputy Marisol Reyes had reactivated the interview room camera at 11:46 on Tuesday night, and she had not told anybody, and she had gone home and slept badly, and come back in on Wednesday and pulled the file at the end of her shift and watched it alone in her car in the parking lot with earbuds in. She had watched a billionaire offer a man his dog's life in exchange for 6.5 acres. She had watched that man decline it and write out a sworn statement in longhand instead. And she had watched Wallace Ballantyne stop at the door and say out loud on camera in a municipal building that he owned the judge who would be hearing the petition on Friday morning. Marisol Reyes was 26 years old. Her grandfather had come back from Vietnam and had spent 40 years not talking about it and had died in a VA facility in Boise on a Tuesday with nobody in the room. She had joined that department 11 months earlier, believing in the plain, uncomplicated way, you can only believe a thing at 25, that the job was about protecting people who could not protect themselves. She had a copy of that file in her hand when the federal agents walked in on Friday morning, and she handed it over herself in front of the entire day shift, standing straight up with her chief 11 feet away watching her do it. Kessler said her name once, just her name like a question. She did not look at him. Wallace Ballantyne arrived at the station at 9:40 because his attorney called him and told him to come, and he came in the way he had come into every room of his adult life. And it took him about 90 seconds to understand that the room was not going to organize itself around him. He tried money last. That was the part that people would talk about in that town for years because it was so precisely what everyone had always suspected and had never actually watched happen. He offered a contribution. He used that word. He said that whatever damage had been done was repairable and that he was prepared to fund a substantial gift to a veterans organization of the Navy's choosing and to cover all veterinary costs and to make certain accommodations regarding the North Shore property. And he said all of it in the tone of a man opening a negotiation he expected to win by lunch. Elena Salazar let him finish. Then she told him that he was not buying his way out of a federal case, that he was adding a count to it, and that everything he had just said had been said in the presence of two federal agents and would appear in a report before the end of the day. He was arrested at 11:10 on charges that began with witness tampering and obstruction and grew over the following 6 weeks into something with racketeering in the caption. Chase Ballantyne was arrested at his father's house at 11:40, and he did not understand even while it was happening that it was real. He kept saying that they had it backwards. He said it in the car. He said it in processing. He asked twice when his father was coming, and the second time the deputy taking his fingerprints told him that his father had been booked an hour before him, and Chase Ballantyne stopped talking and did not say another word for 9 hours. Dax Whitlow was charged Friday afternoon with tampering with evidence and with distributing a materially altered recording in furtherance of a false statement. And he told the agents everything within 20 minutes, and none of it helped him because they already had all of it. Ollie Pratt was not charged. He sat on the concrete steps outside that station for 2 hours on Friday afternoon while his mother stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder, and he cried the way an 18-year-old cries when he has finally done the right thing 4 days too late, which is worse than crying about doing the wrong thing. A federal agent came out at some point and sat down next to him on the step and told him something quiet that nobody else heard, and Ollie nodded and wiped his face with the heel of his hand and did not stop shaking. At 12:15, they opened the cell. Elias Vance had been in that building for 66 hours. He had not eaten since Wednesday. His knuckles were split from Friday morning, and nobody had asked him about it. Elena Salazar was standing in the corridor in her whites, and he came out and looked at her, and 30 years went across that hallway without a word in it. She started to tell him about the road, about the 11 minutes, about the stay order and the helicopter and the trauma team. He held up his hand and stopped her. He asked her one question, and it was the only thing he said in that police station from the moment the door opened to the moment he walked out of it. He asked where his dog was. The drive to Spokane was 2 hours and 11 minutes, and Salazar drove it herself because she did not trust anybody else to, and Elias did not speak for the first hour and a half. Then he said, without being asked anything, that Sarah had picked the dog's name, that she had read a book about it years before about a god who gave up an eye for knowledge and kept two ravens for eyes instead, and that when the litter came through the program, she had told him to take the quiet one at the back, the one who was watching the door. He said he had never told anybody that before. Salazar kept her eyes on the road and told him it was a good name. The neurosurgical team had gone in at 9:20 that morning. They had evacuated the hematoma and relieved the pressure and closed, and the surgeon met them in a corridor at 3 in the afternoon and told Elias that another 8 hours would have been a different conversation and that the animal had come off anesthesia at 1:40 and had responded, and that the left pupil was still slower than the right and might stay that way, and that there was no way to know yet what the last 3 days had cost. They let him in at 4. Elias Vance walked into that recovery room and got down on one knee beside a low steel table with a hip that had been screaming at him for 66 hours, and he put his hand flat on the shepherd's chest. For a long moment there was nothing. Then Odin's eyes opened, and the left one was slow, and it took a second to find him, and it found him. And the tail came off the table. Once, about 4 inches. Elias Vance put his forehead down on the edge of that table and stayed there, and a Navy admiral standing in the doorway turned around and walked out into the hall so the man could have the room. The video went out on a Sunday, and by Tuesday, it had been watched 19 million times. Nobody planned it. That was the strange part. The lawyer in Coeur d'Alene had filed the 41-minute raw file as an exhibit in a public federal docket, and a reporter in Boise had pulled the docket, the way reporters pull dockets out of habit, expecting nothing, and had watched it at her kitchen table at 11 at night, and had then sat very still for a while before she picked up her phone. What went out was not the assault. The court had sealed the worst 40 seconds. What went out was everything around it. A 20-year-old telling a camera that they needed something real. A man in a canvas jacket closing a paperback and asking twice politely for 3 young men to enjoy their afternoons somewhere else. And then after the cut, the same man on his knees in the grass, with a handkerchief pressed to a dog's skull, talking low and steady to an animal that could not hear him properly for 4 full minutes, while the vehicle that had done it drove away behind him. It was the 4 minutes that broke people, not the violence, the kneeling. By Wednesday, it was on the morning shows. By Thursday, there were 340 pieces of mail at the Redstone Bay post office, addressed to a man who did not have a mailbox anyone could find, and the postmaster, a woman named Gail Overby, who had sold Elias Vance stamps for 2 years without ever learning his name, drove them out to the North Shore herself in the back of her own car, and then sat in the driver's seat and cried before she knocked. Most of the letters were from veterans. Some of them were 4 lines long, some of them were 9 pages. A retired canine handler in Georgia wrote about a Belgian Malinois named Sargent, who had been dead 11 years and about whom he had never spoken to his own wife. A woman in Michigan wrote that her husband had come home in 2011 and had not been able to sleep in a bed, and that the only thing that had ever gotten him back into one was a shepherd that a program in Texas had given him for free, and that the dog had died in March, and that she was writing because she did not know who else to tell. Elias read every single one. He sat at that kitchen table for 11 days and read every letter and answered 140 of them in longhand. And he never once mentioned it to anybody. And Nora Bright only found out because she came by with medication and saw the stacks. The money started before he understood what was happening. Somebody had set up a fund for the surgery. Not him, not Salazar, not anybody who asked permission. A stranger in Ohio on Monday morning with a link and a photograph and 11 words. By Friday, it had passed $60,000. By the end of the month, it was over $311,000. Elias found out about it from a bank employee who called the cabin to verify a transfer and could not understand why the man on the other end of the line went quiet for so long. He drove to Spokane that same afternoon and paid the veterinary hospital bill in full $9,412. And then he sat in his truck in that parking lot for 40 minutes with a number on a screen that was more money than he had ever had at one time in his life. Then he went home and did nothing with it for 6 weeks. The trials took 11 months, and the town of Redstone Bay learned something about itself in that time that it did not enjoy learning. Roy Kessler peeled first because the interview room file was not survivable, and because Marisol Reyes's handwritten log of 4 years of Ballantine Group consulting payments was already in front of a grand jury. He got 51 months and he was disbarred from ever holding a peace officer certification in any state. And on the day of his sentencing, he asked to make a statement and then stood up and could not think of anything to say and sat back down. Dax Whitlow got 18 months in 3 years supervised release. He never understood all the way through that he had not been punished for filming. He had been punished for cutting. He said that out loud to a probation officer once, that all he had done was edit, and the probation officer told him that was the whole crime, and Dax genuinely did not follow. Chase Ballantine went to trial because his father's lawyers told him to, and because he believed until the fourth day that this was still a thing that could be handled. The jury was out 11 minutes. 11 minutes for aggravated animal cruelty against a federally protected working dog assault with a deadly weapon and 2 counts of making a false statement to law enforcement. 4 years, and the judge, an 81-year-old man out of Boise who had been a corpsman in 1965 and had never once mentioned it, from the bench took the unusual step of speaking directly to the defendant before sentencing. He said that he had watched the video 11 times. He said that what disturbed him was not the swing, because young men do stupid, violent things and courts exist because of it. What disturbed him was the 40 seconds beforehand when a man had asked twice calmly for nothing but to be left alone. He said that mercy had been available and free and offered twice, and that Chase Ballantine had refused it both times, and that the court was not able to be more generous than the victim had been. Chase looked at his mother in the second row. She did not look up. Wallace Ballantine never went to trial at all. The animal case was the smallest thing in his file by the end. The federal investigation that started with a bribed police chief spread into 4 years of consulting payments, then into the zoning board, then into 2 shell entities in Delaware, and 1 in the Caymans, and then into the marina project itself, where investigators found that the North Shore Marina development had been marketed to 22 private investors on the representation that the land assembly was complete. It had never been complete. It had been 6.5 acres short for 3 years. And Wallace Ballantine had known that every single time he signed a subscription agreement. That was the count that finished him. Not the dog, not the bribes. Wire fraud, 22 counts because a man had refused to sell a piece of ground where his wife had walked as a child. I took a plea at the end of the 10th month. 9 years. Asset forfeiture that took the house on the bluff, the plane, the boat that never left the dock, and a foundation with his family's name on the letterhead. The rendering with the crest and the clubhouse stonework never got built. The lot where the marina was going to be is still there. Somebody put a bench on it. Odin came home in October. I was not the same dog, and everyone had known he would not be. The left pupil stayed slow. He lost most of the hearing on the left side, which the surgeon had warned about, and which turned out to matter less than anyone feared, because 11 years of hand signals meant the dog had never needed to hear Elias to obey him. What was harder was the other thing. For about 2 months, Odin startled. He had never startled in his life, not at gunfire, not at rotor wash, not at anything, and now a dropped pan in the kitchen would take him off the floor. Elias would find him standing in a doorway at 2 in the morning, staring at nothing, breathing hard, and he would get down on the floor beside him and put a hand on his chest and stay there until it passed, sometimes 40 minutes. He never once tried to make the dog stop. He had spent 26 years around men who came home carrying things, and he had learned that you do not talk somebody out of a thing like that. You just refuse to leave the room. By December, it happened once a week. By spring, it was gone. The idea came from a letter. It was from a woman in Arizona whose son had come back in 20 and had been on a waiting list for a service dog for 22 months, and she wrote without any anger in it at all that she did not understand how a country could train an animal for 11 years and then have no plan for either of them afterward. Elias read that letter 4 times, and then he sat there with it in his hand for a long while. He drove to Boise the next week and met with 3 lawyers and an accountant. He put the entire $311,000 in, and then he did the thing that nobody, not Salazar, not Nora, not one person who knew him, saw coming. He deeded the land, all 6.5 acres. The shoreline, the pines, the cabin, everything a billionaire had spent 3 years in an open number trying to buy. He put it in trust in perpetuity as the site of a training and placement center for retired military working dogs and the veterans who need them. And he wrote in the founding document that no dog placed by the center could ever be charged for, and that no application could ever be denied for a reason involving money. Then he named it the Sarah Vance Center for Working Dogs. He cut the sign himself out of a piece of cedar off the property and burned the letters in by hand over 2 evenings. And when Nora Bright asked him why he had not paid somebody to do a proper job of it, he told her that Sarah would have laughed at a professional sign, and that was the entire answer. They broke ground in April. Salazar came out for it in civilian clothes and stood at the back and did not let anybody introduce her. Del Ruiz retired from the harbor that summer and started coming out 4 days a week to build kennel runs for nothing. Gail Overby from the post office organized the food drive. Kyle Brennan, the 26-year-old who had driven that van 4.5 miles, quit county animal control and took a job at the center as its first paid employee. And on his first morning, he asked Elias whether it was all right that he had been the one behind the wheel that day. And Elias told him that a man who reads the log before he drives is exactly who he wanted running the kennels. Marisol Reyes was not a deputy anymore. She had been quietly frozen out in the 8 months after she handed that file to the federal agents. Nothing formal, no reprimand, just shifts that changed without notice, and calls that came late, and a locker room that got quiet when she walked in. She resigned in June, and she was 27 years old and had no idea what she was going to do. And she was sitting in her car outside her apartment when Elias Vance called her and told her the center needed somebody to run intake and coordinate with the VA, and that he could not pay her what the county had. She took it before he finished the sentence. Nora Bright became the center's veterinarian and kept her clinic and worked 11-hour days for 2 years. And if anybody in Redstone Bay noticed that she and Elias had started eating dinner together on Thursdays, nobody in Redstone Bay said anything about it because the town had learned something by then about minding its business with that man. The first dog they placed was a Belgian Malinois named Rook, 7 years old, retired out of Lackland with a bad shoulder, and he went to a 29-year-old Marine in Nampa who had been on a list for 19 months. The Marine's mother called Marisol 6 weeks later to say that her son had slept through the night for the first time since 2020, and Marisol had to put the phone down on the desk and step outside. By the end of the second year, they had placed 41. Ollie Pratt showed up on a Saturday in March, 6 months after the sentencing. He had a backpack, and he had lost about 20 pounds, and he stood at the end of that gravel road for a long time before he made himself walk up it. Elias was on the porch. The boys started talking about 11 feet out, and it came out wrong and too fast about how he knew he had no right, about how he had watched it happen and had done nothing, about how he had laughed. And that was the part he could not get through. He got to the word laughed and his face came apart. He said he had not been able to sleep right in 18 months. Elias let him finish. He let him stand there and get all the way to the end of it because he had learned a long time ago that interrupting a confession is a way of taking it away from a man, and this one had been 18 months in the building. Then he asked him one question. He asked him whether he had known at 3 in the morning in that boathouse that turning over that drive would end his friendships, his summers, his standing in that town, and every soft thing he had left. Ollie said he had known. Elias asked him why he did it anyway. And the boy said because it was true. Elias Vance stood up off that porch and went into the shed and came back out and handed him a bucket and a push broom. He told him the kennels got done first and that everybody starts there. Ollie Pratt worked at the Sarah Vance Center for 4 years. He was 22 when he finished his veterinary technician certification, and Nora Bright signed the recommendation herself. And at his ceremony, there was one row of people there for him, and it was Elias and Nora and Marisol and Del and his mother, and he cried through the whole thing and did not care. He never spoke to Chase Ballantyne again. Chase wrote to him twice from custody in the first year, and Ollie read both letters and did not answer either one, and he kept them in a drawer. And years later, when a young volunteer asked him why he had kept them, Ollie said that he wanted to remember exactly how close he had come to being the other guy. Elias Vance was 56 the last morning of this story. The hip was worse. He used a stick some days now and pretended it was for the ice. There were 19 dogs on the property and 11 staff in a waiting list 11 months long. that he was ashamed of in a second center opening outside Sacramento that he had refused to let anybody name after him. He walked the shore road at 5:30 in the morning, the way he had for 8 years, and Odin walked at his left knee. The dog was 13. He was gray from the muzzle back to the eyes now, and he was slow on the rocks, and he stopped sometimes, and Elias stopped with him, and neither of them made anything of it. He still would not sleep beside the bed. 8 years of a house full of people who loved him, and he still slept across the door, and Elias had long since stopped trying to move him, because it had never been a habit, and it had never been affection. It was a posting, it always had been. A flock of geese came up off the water that morning, loud close 40 of them at once, and the old shepherd lifted his head and tracked them all the way across the bay with his good eye. He did not break heel. Elias reached down and put his hand on top of the dog's head, and the dog leaned into it, and behind them, up the hill where a billionaire had once wanted 90 boat slips in a clubhouse with his family crest in the stone, there were kennel doors opening and men and women calling out to each other and about 19 dogs losing their minds about breakfast. 3 men with more money than a small country had looked at a quiet man in a worn jacket and seen nothing worth respecting. They were wrong, and the cost of being wrong took everything they had, and the ground they wanted so badly is now the place where broken men come to be, given back a reason to get up in the morning. That is the whole truth of it. Money buys lawyers headlines, judges, and silence. It has never once bought a single ounce of what that man had, and it never will.